The keys felt heavier in my hand that morning, but not because of arthritis or age. They felt heavy because my own son had just told me I was too dangerous to drive, too old to make my own decisions, and too senile to manage my own money. What David didn't realize was that at 72, I still had perfect 20/20 vision. Lightning-fast reflexes from decades of teaching middle schoolers, and a memory sharp enough to recall every single dollar I'd invested in his ungrateful life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When he snatched those keys from my kitchen counter and declared he was putting me in Pine Ridge Senior Living for my own safety, he made one crucial mistake. He forgot that the woman who raised him was the same woman who'd been fighting battles long before he was even born. And this one was going to cost him everything. My name is Margaret Chen, though everyone calls me Maggie, and I've lived on Maple Street in Riverside, California for 38 years. I moved here when David was just 7 years old, a single mother determined to give her son the stability I never had growing up. The neighborhood was different then, filled with young families, children riding bicycles until the streetlights came on, and neighbors who actually knew each other's names. I bought the house with money I'd saved teaching 5th grade at Roosevelt Elementary, every penny earned through late nights grading papers and weekend tutoring sessions. The house itself wasn't much to look at back then, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with peeling paint and a yard that looked like it had been neglected for years. But I saw potential where others saw problem. I spent weekends learning to tile bathrooms from YouTube videos, painting every room myself, and slowly transforming that rundown property into something beautiful. David would help sometimes, holding the ladder while I painted the trim, or handing me tools when I fixed the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom. Those were good days, when it felt like we were building something together. As David grew older, I made sure he never wanted for anything. When he joined the high school basketball team, I worked extra hours tutoring struggling students to afford his equipment and travel expenses. When he wanted to take Sarah Mitchell to prom, I drove to 3 different stores to find him the perfect tie that matched her dress. When he decided he wanted to study business at UC Riverside, I took out a second mortgage on the house to help pay for his education, believing that investing in my son's future was the smartest thing I could do. After graduation, David struggled to find his footing. The economy was rough, and entry-level business jobs were scarce. He bounced between several companies, never quite finding his niche, growing more frustrated with each rejection letter. That's when I made what I thought was a generous offer. I told him I'd help him start his own real estate agency. Not a loan, not an investment expecting returns, but a gift from mother to son. I withdrew $40,000 from my retirement savings to cover his licensing fees, office rent, for the first year, marketing materials, and everything else needed to launch Chen & Associates Realty. I remember the day we signed the lease on his office space in the Sunny Grove shopping plaza. David was so excited, talking about his plans to specialize in helping first-time homebuyers, about building a business that would serve families like ours. He hugged me in the parking lot and promised he'd make me proud. For the first time in years, I felt like all those sacrifices had been worth it. My son was finally going to build something meaningful. The first few years were challenging, as any new business would. David worked long hours, 7 days a week, slowly building a client base in Riverside's competitive real estate market. I helped however I could, answering phones when his assistant was sick, bringing him lunch when he forgot to eat, and even helping stage houses for showings when he couldn't afford professional staging. I never asked for repayment or recognition. Seeing him working toward his dreams was payment enough. Then David met Rachel at a real estate conference in Los Angeles. She was working for a large marketing firm, specializing in digital advertising for small businesses. She was intelligent, ambitious, and absolutely stunning. When David brought her home to meet me 6 months later, I could see why he'd fallen for her. Rachel had this confidence about her, the kind that comes from achieving success at a young age. She spoke knowledgeably about market trends, social media strategies, and business development in ways that impressed even me. Their relationship moved quickly. Within a year they were engaged, and Rachel had left her job in Los Angeles to move to Riverside and help David expand his business. She brought fresh ideas and modern marketing techniques that immediately started generating more leads. Suddenly, Chen and Associates was getting featured in local magazines, and David was closing deals with wealthy clients from neighboring cities. I was thrilled to see them working together so effectively. When they got married, I insisted on paying for the wedding reception. It wasn't extravagant, just a lovely garden party at the Riverside Community Center with about 60 guests. But it was beautiful. Rachel looked radiant in her simple but elegant dress, and David couldn't stop smiling. During the father-daughter dance, since Rachel's own father had passed away years earlier, David asked me to join them on the dance floor. It was one of the happiest moments of my life, dancing with my son and his new wife, feeling like our little family was complete. 2 years later, Tyler was born. Becoming a grandmother was a joy I hadn't anticipated. I'd always been so focused on raising David and building my career that I'd never really thought about grandchildren, but holding that tiny baby, seeing David's eyes and Rachel's determined little chin in his face, I felt a love deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. I immediately started contributing to a college fund for Tyler, adding $500 every month from my teacher's pension. As Tyler grew, I became his primary babysitter. Rachel's marketing business was thriving, and David's real estate agency required him to work evenings and weekends showing properties. I didn't mind at all. Tyler was a bright, curious child who reminded me of David at that age. We'd spend afternoons reading together, working on puzzles, and taking walks around the neighborhood. I taught him to ride a bicycle in the same driveway where I'd taught his father decades earlier. When Tyler started school, I helped with homework every afternoon. Having spent my entire career teaching children, I knew how to make learning fun and engaging. Tyler's grades were excellent, and he often told his teachers that his grandmother was the smartest person he knew. Those words meant more to me than any teaching award I'd ever received. The years passed comfortably. David's business continued growing. They bought a larger house in the newer part of Riverside, and Rachel launched her own marketing consultancy. I was proud of their success, proud that my investment in David's future had paid off so well. They invited me for dinner every Sunday, and Tyler spent most weekends at my house, which gave his parents time to focus on their businesses. I maintained my independence carefully. Even as I approached 70, I kept my house immaculate, tended a vegetable garden that was the envy of the neighborhood, and drove myself everywhere I needed to go. My 2018 Honda Civic was reliable and well-maintained, and I'd never had so much as a parking ticket. I grocery shopped on Tuesday mornings when the stores were quiet, attended book club every Thursday evening at the library, and volunteered at the community center's literacy program twice a week. My health was excellent for my age. I took a daily walk around the neighborhood, practiced yoga with Eleanor Thompson, my neighbor and closest friend, and saw my doctor regularly for checkups. My blood pressure was normal, my cholesterol levels were good, and my reflexes were still sharp enough that I could catch Tyler's baseball when he threw it too hard in the backyard. The only concession I'd made to aging was adding David's name to my bank accounts and making him a beneficiary on my retirement funds. It seemed like the practical thing to do, ensuring that if anything happened to me, he could handle my affairs without legal complication. I'd also given him a copy of my house key, just in case of emergencies. These felt like reasonable precautions, not surrender of my autonomy. David and Rachel seemed grateful for everything I'd done for their family, always thanking me for babysitting Tyler, or bringing homemade meals when they were busy with work. They included me in family decisions, asked my advice about Tyler's education, and made sure I felt valued and loved. Rachel would often comment about how lucky Tyler was to have such an involved grandmother, and David would joke that I was the best unpaid employee Chen and Associates had ever had. Looking back now, I can see that I was perhaps too generous, too eager to help, too willing to say yes to every request. When David needed help with his down payment for the new house, I provided $15,000 without hesitation. When Rachel's car broke down and they couldn't afford the repairs while saving for Tyler's private school tuition, I bought her a reliable used car. When Tyler wanted to attend an expensive summer camp that would help him prepare for high school academics, I paid the full fee plus spending money. Each time they expressed genuine gratitude. David would hug me and say he didn't know what they'd do without me. Rachel would tear up and promise they'd pay me back someday when the business was more established. Tyler would draw me pictures, or write thank you notes in his careful elementary school handwriting. I never asked for repayment because I believed I was investing in my family's happiness and security. The warning signs were subtle at first. David started making comments about my driving, pointing out when I took a turn a little wide, or questioning whether I really needed to drive to the grocery store when he could pick things up for me. Rachel would suggest that maybe I should consider moving closer to them, perhaps into one of the new senior living communities where I'd have more social opportunities, and wouldn't have to worry about maintaining such a large house. These conversations always ended with reassurances that they just wanted what was best for me, that they loved me and worried about my safety. I appreciated their concern, even if I didn't think it was necessary. At 72, I was still more capable than many people half my age, but I understood that watching a parent age can be frightening for adult children, so I tried to be patient with their suggestions. Tyler, now 17 and preparing for his senior year of high school, had become more distant. The sweet little boy who used to spend weekends at my house was now a teenager more interested in video games and friends than spending time with his grandmother. This was normal, I told myself. All teenagers pull away from family as they develop their independence. Still, I missed our afternoon conversations, and the way he used to ask my opinion about everything from school projects to friendship drama. What I didn't realize was that my generosity had created an expectation rather than gratitude. What I didn't see was that David and Rachel had begun to view my resources as theirs to manage rather than mine to control. What I didn't understand was that every time I said yes to their requests, I was teaching them that my money, my time and eventually my autonomy were things they could claim whenever convenient. The house that I'd spent decades improving and maintaining, the savings I'd accumulated through careful budgeting and smart investments, the independence I'd fought so hard to preserve, all of it was about to become a battleground. And the war was about to begin with something as simple as a set of car keys. The shift started so gradually that I almost didn't notice it at first. David began dropping by my house more frequently, but not for the warm family visits we used to enjoy. Instead, he'd walk through my rooms with a critical eye, pointing out things that needed attention. The guest bathroom faucet dripped occasionally, he observed, and wouldn't it be expensive to fix if it got worse? The roof had a few loose shingles from the last windstorm, and roofing repairs could cost thousands if I waited too long. The hardwood floors in the living room were showing their age, and refinishing them would be quite an undertaking for someone my age. At first, I appreciated his concern. David had always been observant, and as a real estate agent, he knew about home maintenance issues that I might overlook. I thanked him for pointing out these problems and assured him I'd handle them when my budget allowed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But his visits became more frequent, and his observations more pointed. He'd run his finger along the windowsills, noting dust I'd missed during my weekly cleaning. He'd test the smoke detector batteries and suggest I might forget to change them regularly. He'd check the expiration dates on items in my pantry, questioning whether I was keeping track of things properly. Rachel started accompanying him on these visits, armed with printouts from websites about home safety for seniors. She'd show me articles about elderly people who'd fallen in their own homes, statistics about house fires caused by forgotten appliances, and testimonials from families who'd moved their aging parents into assisted living facilities. Her tone was always caring and concerned, but there was an underlying message that I was becoming a liability to myself. The conversations about my driving intensified. David would mention close calls he'd supposedly witnessed while following behind me, though I couldn't recall any incidents that matched his description. He'd ask if I'd considered whether my reaction time was still fast enough for busy intersections, or whether night driving was becoming more challenging. Rachel would share stories about elderly drivers who'd caused accidents in other cities, always ending with comments about how terrible the families must have felt knowing they could have prevented such tragedy. Tyler, when he bothered to visit at all, would roll his eyes at what he called my old lady habits. I kept my thermostat at 72 degrees, which he declared wastefully high. I preferred to shop with cash rather than cards, which he said was outdated and suspicious to store clerks. I didn't use social media or online banking, which he claimed made me vulnerable to missing important information or falling behind on bills. Even my preference for cooking from scratch rather than using pre-packaged meals became evidence of my inability to adapt to modern convenience. The first real boundary violation happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I was getting ready to drive to my weekly grocery shopping trip when David appeared at my front door with a key in his hand. He'd let himself into my house without knocking, something he'd never done before. When I expressed surprise at his unannounced entry, he reminded me that I'd given him a key for emergencies and said he'd been worried when I didn't answer his phone calls immediately. I explained that I'd been in the shower and hadn't heard the phone, but David seemed skeptical. He asked if I was sure I hadn't forgotten about his calls, or perhaps dozed off and missed them. His doubt about my mental clarity stung, but I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he really had been worried and I was being too sensitive about his concern. That same visit, David announced that he'd been researching my car insurance policy and discovered that my coverage might be insufficient if I were involved in an accident. He'd taken the liberty of contacting my insurance agent to discuss additional coverage options, he said, because he wanted to make sure I was protected. When I pointed out that my insurance had been adequate for decades and I'd never had any claims, David replied that things were different now, that I was at higher risk because of my age, and that he was just trying to be responsible. The presumption that he could make decisions about my insurance without consulting me first was troubling, but David framed it as looking out for my best interests. He'd brought paperwork for me to sign, increasing my coverage and adding him as an authorized contact on my policy. When I hesitated, he asked if I didn't trust his judgment about protecting our family's assets. The way he said, "our family's assets," made something uncomfortable twist in my stomach, but I signed the papers to avoid an argument. Rachel's involvement became more intrusive as well. She started showing up at my house while David was showing properties, ostensibly to spend time with me but actually to conduct what felt like wellness checks. She'd go through my refrigerator, claiming she wanted to see if I needed anything from the store, but really examining expiration dates and questioning my meal planning. She'd flip through my mail, supposedly helping me organize it, but really checking whether I was keeping up with bills and correspondence. During one of these visits, Rachel discovered that I'd been writing checks to several charities each month, donations I'd been making for years to organizations supporting literacy programs and animal shelter. She expressed concern about elderly people being targeted by scammers and suggested that I might be giving money to fraudulent organizations without realizing it. When I showed her the legitimate documentation from these well-established charities, she shifted tactics and worried aloud about whether I could afford to be so generous with my fixed income. The conversation about my charitable giving led to a broader discussion about my finances that made me deeply uncomfortable. Rachel asked detailed questions about my monthly expenses, my retirement income, and my savings account. She suggested that I might benefit from having someone help me create a budget and monitor my spending to ensure I didn't outlive my money. When I mentioned that I'd been managing my finances successfully for decades, Rachel replied that cognitive decline could be so gradual that people didn't realize they were making poor decisions until significant damage had been done. Tyler's attitude toward me became openly dismissive. When I offered to help him with a history project about World War II, drawing on my knowledge from years of teaching and my father's military service, he told me that Wikipedia was more reliable than old people's memory. When I suggested we cook dinner together like we used to, he said he didn't have time for slow activities and would rather order pizza. When I tried to engage him in conversation about his plans for college, he responded with monosyllables and spent the entire visit staring at his phone. The most hurtful comment came when Tyler was complaining to his parents about having to spend Sunday dinners at my house. He didn't realize I was in the kitchen and could hear him clearly. He told David and Rachel that hanging out with me was boring because I repeated the same stories, asked the same questions, and moved too slowly through everything. He said his friends thought it was weird that he had to visit his grandmother so often, and he wished they could just have normal family dinners at their own house without having to babysit Grandma Maggie. David's response to his son's complaint was what really broke my heart. Instead of defending me or correcting Tyler's disrespectful attitude, David agreed that maybe they'd been relying on me too much for family obligation. He suggested that as I got older, it might be better to simplify our arrangements and reduce the frequency of our get-togethers to avoid overwhelming me. The implication that spending time with my own family was somehow too taxing for me to handle was devastating. The financial pressure started subtly. David began mentioning how expensive it was to maintain two households, his family's house and mine. He'd comment on the cost of heating and cooling my three-bedroom house when I only used two rooms regularly. He'd calculate how much money I spent on lawn care and house cleaning services, suggesting that these expenses would only increase as I became less able to handle such tasks myself. He'd point out that property taxes on my house kept rising, and on a fixed income, these costs would become increasingly burdensome. Rachel started bringing real estate listings to show me, featuring condominiums and apartments in senior living communities. She'd highlight the amenities like housekeeping services, meal plans, and social activities, presenting them as luxurious conveniences rather than necessities for people who couldn't care for themselves. She'd calculate how much equity I had in my current house and how far that money would stretch in a smaller, more manageable living situation. The pressure intensified when David suggested that I might want to consider making him a co-owner of my house for estate planning purposes. He explained that if something happened to me suddenly, transferring the property could be complicated and expensive without proper legal arrangements. By adding his name to the deed now while I was still healthy and competent, we could avoid probate costs and ensure a smooth transition of assets. When I expressed reluctance to make such a significant change, David seemed hurt. He asked if I didn't trust him to act in my best interests, or if I thought he would somehow take advantage of me. He reminded me of all the times he'd helped me with home repairs and maintenance, all the errands he'd run when I was busy or tired, all the ways he'd proven his reliability and devotion as a son. Making him a co-owner would just formalize the partnership we already had, he argued, and it would give him the legal authority to help me more effectively. Rachel supported David's suggestion by sharing stories about families who'd faced enormous legal bills and bureaucratic nightmares when elderly parents died without proper estate plans. She'd found articles about houses that had to be sold quickly to pay probate costs, leaving families with much less inheritance than they'd expected. She presented adding David to my deed as a smart financial strategy that would protect both my interests and the family's future security. The pressure to sign over partial ownership of my house continued for weeks. David would bring it up during casual conversations, always framing it as a simple administrative task that would benefit everyone involved. Rachel would leave estate planning pamphlets on my kitchen counter, highlighting sections about joint ownership and asset protection. Even Tyler, when he deigned to speak to me at all, would make comments about how cool it would be when the house was officially part of his inheritance. I consulted with Eleanor Thompson, my neighbor and closest friend, about the situation. Eleanor was 85 and had dealt with similar pressure from her own adult children before moving into a senior community by her own choice. She listened carefully to my concerns and then gave me advice that proved to be prophetic. She warned me that once I started giving up control of my assets, it would be almost impossible to get that control back. She said that adult children who began managing their parents' affairs often convinced themselves they were acting in everyone's best interests, even when they were really acting in their own. Eleanor's words resonated with me, but I also felt torn between my instinct to maintain independence and my desire to trust my son. David had always been a good kid, and he'd grown into a successful adult. Surely he wouldn't manipulate or take advantage of his own mother. But the pressure he and Rachel were applying felt different from the loving concern I'd expected from family members worried about my welfare. The breaking point in this phase came during a family dinner at David's house in late April. I'd driven myself there, as I always did, parking carefully in their driveway and walking to the front door without assistance. But when dinner was over and I prepared to leave, David announced that he'd drive me home and Rachel would follow in my car. When I protested that I was perfectly capable of driving myself, David and Rachel exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Rachel began listing reasons why it would be safer for David to drive me home. The sun was setting, which made visibility more challenging. I'd had 2 glasses of wine with dinner, which might impair my judgment even if I didn't feel intoxicated. The route between their house and mine included several busy intersections that required quick decision-making. Tyler chimed in that his friend's grandmother had gotten confused driving at night and ended up lost for hours before police found her. I insisted that I felt completely alert and capable of driving, that I'd made the same trip hundreds of times, and that I'd only had wine with my meal 2 hours earlier. But David was adamant. He said that as my son, he couldn't allow me to take unnecessary risks, and if something happened to me on the drive home, he'd never forgive himself. He took my car keys from my purse before I could stop him, saying he was making an executive decision for my own safety. The ride home in David's car was tense and humiliating. He drove exactly the speed limit, stopped for a full 3 seconds at every stop sign, and provided a running commentary about road hazards and traffic patterns, as if I were a child who'd never seen a car before. When we arrived at my house, he walked me to the door and waited while I unlocked it, as if I might collapse or get confused about which key to use. Rachel arrived a few minutes later with my Honda, but instead of giving me back my keys, she handed them to Dave. She said they'd discussed it, and decided that maybe I should take a break from driving for a few days, just to be safe. They'd be happy to run any errands I needed, and David could drive me to my book club meeting on Thursday if I still wanted to go. The condescending tone in her voice made me feel like a teenager being grounded by disapproving parents. That night, I sat in my living room, feeling more alone and frustrated than I had in years. The people I'd loved and supported my entire adult life were treating me like an incompetent child. They were making decisions about my life without my input, taking control of my belongings without my permission, and justifying their actions by claiming they knew what was best for me better than I knew myself. I called Eleanor to talk through what had happened, and she was furious on my behalf. She said that what David and Rachel were doing was the beginning of a pattern that could escalate quickly if I didn't stand up for myself immediately. She'd seen it happen to other friends, she said, where adult children gradually took over every aspect of their parents' lives, always with explanations about safety and welfare, until the elderly parents had no autonomy left at all. Eleanor's advice was clear and direct. I needed to reclaim my car keys immediately, and establish firm boundaries about my independence. If I allowed David and Rachel to control my transportation, they'd soon be controlling where I went, when I went, and eventually whether I went anywhere at all. She offered to come with me the next day to demand my keys back, providing moral support and witness to the conversation. But first, I decided to do something that would show David and Rachel exactly how sharp and capable my mind still was. I spent that evening reviewing all of my financial records, bank statements, investment accounts, and insurance policies. I wanted to have complete clarity about my assets and legal rights before the next confrontation. What I discovered during that review was going to change everything, because I realized that my generosity over the years had been far more extensive than even I had remembered, and David's gratitude had been far more superficial than I'd ever imagined. The documents spread across my dining room table told a story I'd been too generous to see clearly before. Bank statements, canceled checks, credit card receipts, and investment withdrawal records painted a picture of my financial relationship with David that was far more one-sided than I'd remember. Over the past 15 years, I'd given him nearly $200,000 in direct cash gifts, business investments, and family support. The house down payment, the car for Rachel, Tyler's private school tuition, David's office rent during slow months, emergency funds for unexpected expenses, and countless smaller amounts that had seemed insignificant at the time. What struck me most was the pattern revealed in my bank records. Every few months, there would be a large withdrawal or transfer, always preceded by a phone call from David about some crisis or opportunity that required immediate financial assistance. His real estate business was struggling with a difficult market. Rachel's marketing clients were late on payments. Tyler needed money for school activities or equipment. The family car needed major repairs they couldn't afford while saving for other priorities. Each time I'd responded immediately, transferring money or writing checks without hesitation. David and Rachel always promised to pay me back when their situation improved, but the repayments never materialized. Instead, there would be explanations about unexpected expenses that delayed their ability to return my money, followed eventually by new requests that made the previous loans seem forgotten entirely. The most revealing discovery was a file of real estate documents that David had left in my guest room after one of his recent visits. Among the papers were market analyses for properties in my neighborhood, including a detailed valuation of my house. Someone had researched comparable sales, assessed my property's condition, and calculated its current market value at $450,000. The analysis included projections for future appreciation and recommendations for improvements that could increase its selling price. More disturbing were handwritten notes in David's recognizable scrawl, outlining scenarios for accessing my home's equity. One page detailed the process for adding a co-owner to a property deed, including legal requirements and timeline for completion. Another page listed assisted living facilities in the area, with costs per month and notes about which ones had the shortest waiting lists. A third page calculated how far my assets would stretch if my housing costs were reduced and my investment accounts were managed more aggressively. The picture became crystal clear. David and Rachel weren't just concerned about my welfare, they were actively planning to gain control of my finances and property. Their suggestions about estate planning and co-ownership weren't motivated by love or protection. They were motivated by greed, disguised as concern. The pressure to move into senior living wasn't about my safety, it was about liquidating my biggest asset for their benefit. Eleanor arrived at 9 o'clock the next morning, armed with determination and a thermos of coffee. She'd dealt with similar situations when her own children had tried to pressure her into giving up her independence, and she knew exactly how to handle manipulative family members who confused concern with control. We reviewed my financial records together, and Eleanor was appalled by the extent of David's financial dependence on me. Her advice was strategic and practical. First, I needed to secure my assets by removing David's access to my accounts and changing any passwords or authorization he might have. Second, I needed to reclaim my car keys and establish clear boundaries about my independence. Third, I needed to make it explicitly clear that any future financial assistance would depend on his respect for my autonomy. Eleanor had learned the hard way that generous parents often enabled their children's irresponsible behavior by removing natural consequences for poor decisions. We drove to First National Bank in Eleanor's car, where I met with Patricia Williams, the branch manager who'd handled my accounts for over a decade. Patricia was surprised when I explained that I wanted to remove David's access to my accounts and change all of my passwords and security questions. She asked if there had been some kind of family dispute, and I explained that I was simply updating my security arrangements to reflect my current preferences. The process took nearly 2 hours, but by the time we finished, David no longer had any authority to access my checking accounts, savings accounts, or investment portfolio. I opened a new checking account that only I could access, and I arranged for my pension and Social Security deposits to be transferred to the new account. Patricia assured me that David would receive no notification of these changes unless he tried to access the accounts and was denied permission. From the bank, Eleanor and I drove to David's real estate office. I decided that a public confrontation might be more effective than a private conversation, since David would be less likely to become aggressive or manipulative with potential clients and employees watching. Chen and Associates occupied a corner suite in the Sunny Grove shopping plaza, with large windows displaying property listings and promotional materials featuring David's professional headshot. David was at his desk when we walked in, talking on the phone with what sounded like a potential buyer. His expression shifted from surprise to concern when he saw me with Eleanor instead of calling first to arrange a visit. He quickly ended his phone call and approached us with the kind of forced smile that suggested he was already preparing explanations for whatever had prompted this unexpected appearance. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I extended my hand and said clearly, loud enough for his assistant and the other agent in the office to hear, that I wanted my car keys back immediately. David's smile faltered, and he glanced around the office nervously before suggesting we move to his private office to discuss the matter. I declined, stating that I saw no reason for privacy since I was simply retrieving my own property. David's first response was to question whether I was feeling all right, whether something had upset me, and whether we should call Rachel to help sort out whatever misunderstanding had occurred. He spoke in the patronizing tone that adults use with confused children, loud enough for everyone in the office to hear his concern about my mental state. His assistant looked up from her computer with obvious interest, and I realized this was exactly the kind of public manipulation Eleanor had warned me about. I responded by stating calmly and clearly that I was feeling perfectly fine, thinking completely clearly, and simply wanted to reclaim possession of my own car keys so I could drive myself home. When David hesitated, I added that if he preferred, I could call the police to report that my son was unlawfully withholding my property, but I hoped that wouldn't be necessary since I was sure he would do the right thing and return what belonged to me. The mention of police involvement changed David's demeanor immediately. His forced concern became genuine anxiety as he realized that other people in the office were listening to our conversation and forming their own opinions about the situation. He quickly retrieved my keys from his desk drawer and handed them to me, but not before attempting one more manipulation. David announced to the office that he'd been keeping my keys overnight because he was worried about my night vision and wanted me to have my eyes checked before driving after dark. He said this with such conviction that I almost wondered if he actually believed his own lie. But Eleanor stepped forward and pointed out that it was currently 10:30 in the morning on a bright sunny day, making David's excuse about night vision completely irrelevant to the current situation. The moment I had my keys back, I felt a surge of empowerment that I hadn't experienced in months. I thanked David for returning my property and told him I'd be driving myself home now, just as I'd been doing safely for over 50 years. When he started to object, I cut him off by saying that I was sure he had important work to do, and I didn't want to keep him from serving his clients any longer. As Eleanor and I walked toward the door, David called after me asking when we could sit down to discuss some important family matters that needed attention. I turned back and told him that I'd be happy to discuss family matters whenever he was ready to treat me as an equal adult family member rather than as an incompetent child who needed management. The stunned expression on his face told me that he'd never considered the possibility that I might rebel against his controlling behavior. The drive home in my own car felt like a declaration of independence. Every turn signal, every lane change, every decision about route and speed was mine to make without consultation or supervision. I'd forgotten how much autonomy I'd surrendered by allowing David and Rachel to question my capabilities and override my choice. Reclaiming my car keys was just the beginning of reclaiming my life. That afternoon, David called repeatedly, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails demanding to know what had gotten into me and insisting that we needed to talk immediately. Rachel sent text messages asking if I was angry about something, and offering to bring dinner so we could work through whatever misunderstanding had occurred. I didn't respond to any of their attempts at contact, choosing instead to spend the day reviewing more of my financial records and planning my next moves. Eleanor stayed for dinner, and we strategized about how to handle the inevitable confrontation with David and Rachel. She advised me to prepare for them to escalate their manipulation tactics, possibly involving Tyler in emotional appeals, or even threatening to cut off contact with their family if I didn't cooperate with their plan. Eleanor had seen families use grandchildren as weapons in these situations, and she wanted me to be prepared for the worst-case scenarios. The confrontation came the next evening. David and Rachel arrived at my house without invitation, using David's key to enter when I didn't answer the door immediately. I was in my garden, watering the tomato plants I'd started from seeds in March, and I heard them calling my name from inside the house with obvious agitation in their voices. When I came inside, they were both standing in my living room looking upset and determined. Rachel started the conversation by expressing relief that I was safe, explaining that they'd been worried sick when I didn't return their calls or messages. She said they'd been imagining terrible scenarios about what might have happened to me, and David had barely slept the night before from anxiety about my well-being. The performance was Oscar-worthy, with genuine tears in Rachel's eyes and visible tension in David's posture. I responded by pointing out that I was a grown woman who'd lived independently for decades, and one day without contact hardly constituted a crisis requiring them to let themselves into my house uninvited. When David started to object that he'd been given a key for emergencies, I clarified that a disagreement about car keys didn't constitute an emergency that authorized him to enter my home without permission. The conversation quickly escalated when David demanded to know why I'd gone to his office to humiliate him in front of his colleagues and clients. He accused me of making him look like a terrible son who mistreated his elderly mother, potentially damaging his professional reputation in a business that depended on trust and reliability. Rachel supported his complaint by wondering aloud why I'd chosen to handle our family disagreement in such a public and embarrassing way. I explained that I'd gone to his office because it was where he'd taken my property, and I'd wanted it returned immediately rather than waiting for him to decide when and how to give it back. I pointed out that if he was embarrassed by his behavior being witnessed by others, perhaps he should reconsider whether his behavior was appropriate rather than blaming me for exposing it. This was when Rachel revealed the real purpose of their visit. She said they'd been doing research about elderly drivers and had learned some disturbing statistics about accident rates and cognitive decline in people over 70. She'd printed out articles from medical websites and news stories about senior citizens who'd caused serious accidents because they'd refused to acknowledge their diminished capabilities. She spread these papers across my coffee table like evidence in a criminal trial. David picked up the narrative, explaining that they'd scheduled an appointment for me with a geriatric specialist who could evaluate my cognitive function and determine whether I was still safe to drive. He said this wasn't optional, that as my family they had a responsibility to protect both me and innocent people who might be injured if I caused an accident. He'd already talked to Tyler about the situation, and even my grandson was worried about my judgment and decision-making ability. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. They were using my love for Tyler against me, suggesting that even he thought I was becoming incompetent. They were threatening my independence with medical evaluations that could be used to declare me unfit for self-care. They were positioning themselves as responsible family members protecting society from my dangerous behavior, when the only dangerous behavior I'd exhibited was refusing to surrender control of my own life. I responded by asking David directly whether he thought I was mentally incompetent. When he hesitated, clearly recognizing the legal implications of that question, I pressed further. If he believed I lacked the mental capacity to make decisions about driving, then how could he justify taking money from me for his business expenses and family needs? Surely a person too incompetent to drive would also be too incompetent to make major financial decisions. The logic trap worked perfectly. David backtracked immediately, insisting that he'd never questioned my mental capacity, only my physical reflexes and sensory ability. But Rachel, perhaps not understanding the legal minefield they were navigating, doubled down by saying that cognitive decline could be selective, affecting some abilities while leaving others intact. I stood up and walked to my dining room, returning with the financial records I'd reviewed the day before. I spread them out on the coffee table next to Rachel's medical articles and asked David and Rachel to explain how someone with cognitive decline, significant enough to make driving dangerous, could have managed complex financial planning, investment decisions, and budget management for decades without any problems. The documents told their own stories: regular bill payments, strategic investment moves, careful tax planning, and detailed record-keeping that demonstrated exactly the kind of executive function that would be impaired by the cognitive decline they were claiming to worry about. I pointed out that if they truly believed I was becoming incompetent, they should be concerned about my ability to manage the money they'd been taking from me, not just my ability to drive a car. David's response revealed everything. He said that financial decisions were different from driving, because they involved smaller, less immediate risks, and mistakes could be corrected over time. But a driving mistake could kill someone instantly, which was why they had to take my keys away even if I was still capable of handling other responsibilities. The admission that he considered my money management adequate while my driving was supposedly dangerous exposed the selective nature of their concern. That's when I asked the question that changed everything. I looked directly at David and asked him how much money he thought he'd borrowed from me over the years. When he gave a vague answer about a few thousand here and there, I showed him my calculation. Nearly $200,000 in direct transfers, gifts and payments over 15 years, with no repayment plan and no acknowledgement of the actual amount involved. The room went silent. Rachel's face went pale as she processed the number, and David's expression shifted from defensive to panic. I continued by asking whether they thought someone with cognitive decline would be capable of tracking such detailed financial records, or whether perhaps their concern about my mental capacity was more selective than they'd admit. David's response was to attack my record-keeping, suggesting that I'd double-counted some expenses or included gifts that shouldn't be considered loans. But I was prepared for this objection. I showed them bank statements, canceled checks and electronic transfer records that documented every transaction. There was no ambiguity about the amounts or the dates, and David's attempts to minimize the totals only made his desperation more obvious. Rachel tried a different approach, suggesting that maybe we should all take some time to cool down and revisit the conversation when emotions weren't running so high. She said that family disagreements could often be resolved with better communication and compromise, and she was sure we could find a solution that addressed everyone's concerns. But I was done compromising. I told them both that I'd been compromising for years, accommodating their suggestions, accepting their limitations on my independence, and funding their lifestyle while they gradually took control of my life. The compromise phase was over, and now we were moving into the consequences phase. That's when I delivered the news that would change everything. I informed them that I'd visited the bank and removed David's access to all of my accounts. I explained that going forward, any financial assistance I provided would be based on my assessment of genuine need and their respect for my autonomy, not on their ability to manipulate me with false concern about my safety. David's reaction was immediate and explosive. He accused me of being vindictive and irrational, of punishing him for trying to protect me, of putting our entire family at risk by making financial decisions based on hurt feelings rather than practical necessity. His mask of concern finally slipped completely, revealing the entitled anger that had been building underneath his manipulation. Rachel's reaction was more calculated. She suggested that perhaps my emotional response to their concern was itself evidence that I wasn't thinking clearly, that people experiencing cognitive decline often became paranoid and suspicious of family members who were trying to help them. She said that removing David's access to my accounts might prevent him from helping me if I had a medical emergency or financial crisis. The irony was perfect. They were now arguing that taking control of my own money was evidence of mental incompetence, while their previous arguments had been based on the premise that I was competent enough to make financial decisions but not driving decisions. Their desperation was making them contradict their own manipulation tactics. I responded by pointing out that if I was mentally incompetent, then they should be filing for legal guardianship rather than trying to convince me to voluntarily surrender my independence. If I was mentally competent, then my decisions about my money and my driving were mine to make, regardless of whether they agreed with those decisions. They couldn't have it both ways. The confrontation ended when David made a threat that revealed his true priority. He said that if I was going to be stubborn and uncooperative, maybe it was time for him to step back from helping me altogether. Rachel supported this by suggesting that they needed to focus on their own family's needs rather than worrying about someone who didn't appreciate their efforts to help. I looked at them both for a long moment, seeing clearly for the first time the people they'd become. Then I smiled and told them that I thought stepping back sounded like an excellent idea. I suggested they start by returning the spare key to my house, since they wouldn't be needing it anymore if they were stepping back from helping me. The shock on their faces was worth all the years of manipulation I'd endured. They'd expected me to beg them not to abandon me, to promise to be more cooperative if they'd just continue including me in their lives. Instead, I was calling their bluff and accepting their threat as an offer. As they left my house that night, I knew the real battle was just beginning. But for the first time in years I felt like I had a chance of winning. The silence from David and Rachel lasted exactly 4 days. 4 blissful days of no unexpected visits, no concerned phone calls, no manipulative suggestions about my welfare or safety. I spent those days organizing my financial records, consulting with an estate planning attorney, and researching my legal rights as an elderly person facing potential family exploitation. What I discovered was both empowering and disturbing. Eleanor introduced me to her attorney, Margaret Foster, a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in elder law and family financial disputes. Margaret reviewed my situation with the kind of professional detachment that helped me see the patterns clearly. She explained that what David and Rachel had been doing had a name: financial elder abuse. The gradual assumption of control over my assets, the manipulation of my emotions to gain access to my money, and the threats to my independence were all classic tactics used by family members to exploit elderly relatives. Margaret's advice was comprehensive and strategic. First, I needed to document everything that had happened, creating a paper trail that would protect me if the situation escalated into legal proceedings. Second, I should consider whether David's access to my accounts over the years had resulted in any unauthorized transactions that could be considered theft. Third, I needed to understand that once I drew clear boundaries, David and Rachel would likely escalate their manipulation tactics before they accepted defeat. The escalation began on Thursday morning, with a phone call from Tyler. My 17-year-old grandson, who had barely spoken to me in months, suddenly called to tell me how much he loved me and how worried he was about my health. He said his parents had told him about my recent episodes, and wondered if I was feeling depressed or confused about anything. His voice carried the stilted quality of someone delivering a rehearsed speech, and I realized David and Rachel were using him as their newest weapon. Tyler explained that he'd been doing research for a school project about aging and had learned about something called sundowning, where elderly people became agitated and irrational in the evening hours. He wondered if that might explain why I'd been making such strange decisions lately, like changing my bank accounts and refusing to let his father help. The terminology was too sophisticated for a teenager to have discovered on his own, and I recognized Rachel's influence in the clinical language he was using. When I assured Tyler that I was feeling perfectly fine and thinking clearly, he pressed hard. He said that people experiencing cognitive decline often didn't realize they were having problems, which was why family members had to step in to help. He mentioned that his friend's grandmother had seemed normal right up until she drove her car through a storefront window, and how terrible everyone felt for not intervening sooner. The conversation was heartbreaking, because I could hear the genuine concern in Tyler's voice mixed with the manipulative talking points his parents had fed him. He really believed that I was in danger, that his father was trying to protect me, and that my resistance to their help was evidence of mental deterioration. David and Rachel had poisoned my relationship with my grandson by convincing him that my independence was a symptom of illness. I ended the call by telling Tyler that I loved him too, and that if he was ever concerned about my well-being, he was welcome to visit me and see for himself how I was doing. I suggested that maybe we could work on his school project together, since I had decades of experience working with people of all ages and might be able to provide some helpful perspective on aging and cognitive health. Tyler's response revealed the depth of his parents' influence. He said he'd love to visit, but his parents thought it might be too stimulating for me right now while I was going through this difficult period. They'd suggested that family visits should be limited until I was feeling more stable and had gotten some professional help for my confusion and agitation. The realization that David and Rachel were isolating me from Tyler hit like a physical blow. They weren't just trying to control my money and independence. They were systematically cutting me off from the family relationships that gave my life meaning. Tyler was being taught to see me as a burden and a danger rather than as his grandmother who loved him unconditionally. That afternoon, David called with a tone of forced patience and concern. He said he'd spoken with Tyler and was worried that our conversation had upset his son. He suggested that maybe I needed some time to adjust to the changes in our family dynamic, and perhaps it would be better if I took a break from direct contact with Tyler until I was feeling more like myself again. When I pointed out that I was feeling exactly like myself and had no intention of being cut off from my grandson, David's patience evaporated. He accused me of being selfish and stubborn, of refusing to acknowledge that my behavior was frightening and confusing to Tyler. He said that if I really loved my grandson, I'd want to protect him from witnessing my decline rather than forcing him to watch me deteriorate. The conversation revealed David's true strategy. He was painting my assertion of independence as evidence of mental illness, using my love for Tyler against me, and positioning himself as the responsible family member protecting everyone from my dangerous instability. It was manipulation at its most sophisticated and cruel level. I responded by asking David directly whether he believed I was legally incompetent to make my own decisions. When he hedged, I pressed the question harder. If he thought I was mentally incompetent, then he should file for guardianship through the courts and present evidence to a judge. If he thought I was mentally competent, then he needed to respect my right to make my own choices about my money, my living situation, and my relationships. David's answer was telling. He said that legal incompetence was a very high standard that didn't account for the subtle cognitive changes that could make someone vulnerable to poor judgment. He argued that I could still function in many areas while being impaired in others, and that loving family members sometimes had to make difficult decisions to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The legal consultation with Margaret Foster had prepared me for exactly this argument. I told David that if he believed I was suffering from cognitive impairment significant enough to justify overriding my autonomous decisions, then he should schedule a formal neuropsychological evaluation with a qualified specialist. I would gladly submit to such an evaluation, conducted by an independent professional of my choosing, with the understanding that if I was found competent, he would cease all attempts to control my life. David's response was immediate and panicked. He said that wasn't necessary, that he was sure such tests would be stressful and upsetting for me, and that we could work things out as a family without involving outside professionals. His refusal to accept my offer of professional evaluation exposed the hollowness of his concerns about my mental capacity. I pressed the advantage by explaining that I'd consulted with an elder law attorney who'd helped me understand my rights and options. Margaret Foster had reviewed my situation and confirmed that I was showing no signs of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. She'd also explained the legal definition of financial elder abuse and the remedies available to victims of such abuse. The mention of legal consultation and elder abuse changed the entire dynamic of our conversation. David's voice became strained as he asked what exactly I'd told this attorney, and whether I was considering taking legal action against my own family. The fear in his voice was unmistakable, and I realized that he was finally beginning to understand the potential consequences of his behavior. I explained that I hadn't made any decisions about legal action, but I wanted David to understand that his attempts to control my finances and isolate me from Tyler could have serious legal ramifications if they continued. Margaret Foster had documented our consultation and was prepared to represent me if the situation escalated further. The call ended with David promising to reconsider his approach to our family situation, but his tone suggested anger rather than genuine reflection. I knew that backing down wasn't in his nature and that he and Rachel would likely escalate their tactics before admitting defeat. The escalation came in the form of a surprise visit from Adult Protective Service. On Monday morning, a caseworker named James Rodriguez appeared at my door explaining that his office had received a report of possible elder abuse or neglect. He was required to investigate any such reports to ensure the safety and well-being of elderly residents in the community. James was professional and courteous, but the implications of his visit were clear. Someone had filed a formal complaint claiming that I was either being abused by others or was unable to care for myself safely. The complaint triggers an official investigation that could result in court-ordered protective services or involuntary placement in a care facility if I was found to be at risk. I invited James inside and answered all of his questions honestly and thoroughly. He asked about my living situation, my ability to manage daily activities, my social support network, and any concerns I had about my safety or well-being. He toured my house, noting the cleanliness and organization, the well-stocked refrigerator, and the evidence of active hobbies and interests. James also asked specifically about my relationship with my family and whether anyone had been pressuring me to make financial decisions or give up control of my affairs. His questions were carefully worded, but I recognized that he was investigating the possibility that David and Rachel had filed the report as a way to gain official support for their efforts to control my life. I provided James with documentation of my recent legal consultation, my financial records showing competent money management, and contact information for Eleanor and other friends who could vouch for my independence and mental clarity. I also gave him a detailed account of David and Rachel's escalating attempts to control my life, framing their behavior as the real threat to my well-being. James spent nearly 2 hours completing his evaluation, and his conclusions were reassuring. He found no evidence of neglect, abuse, or diminished capacity that would warrant protective intervention. My house was well maintained, my personal care was excellent, and my mental status was clearly intact. He noted in his report that I appeared to be a highly functioning, independent adult who was appropriately managing her own affairs. Before leaving, James provided me with information about resources available to elderly residents who were experiencing family conflicts or pressure from relatives, seeking to control their assets. He explained that his office could provide ongoing monitoring if I felt threatened or unsafe, and that there were legal protections available for seniors facing financial exploitation by family members. The APS investigation backfired spectacularly on David and Rachel. Not only did it fail to provide official support for their claims about my incapacity, but it created an official record documenting their attempts to use government agencies to override my autonomous decisions. James's report would be available if future legal proceedings became necessary. 2 days after the APS visit, Rachel appeared at my door with a completely different approach. Gone was the concerned daughter-in-law worried about my safety. Instead, she arrived with a folder full of real estate listings and a calculated business proposition. Rachel explained that she'd been thinking about our recent misunderstandings and had realized that maybe they'd been approaching the situation from the wrong angle. Instead of focusing on my limitations, they should be helping me maximize my opportunities. She'd found several luxury senior living communities that offered independent living options for active adults who wanted to simplify their lives without sacrificing autonomy. The sales pitch was polished and appealing. Rachel showed me glossy brochures featuring elegant apartments with full kitchens, resort-style amenities, and social programs designed for educated, sophisticated residents. She calculated how much equity I could realize from selling my house, how the proceeds could fund a comfortable lifestyle in one of these communities, and how much money would be left over for travel, hobbies, and family gifts. Rachel's new approach was more dangerous than David's heavy-handed manipulation because it appealed to legitimate concerns about aging in place. The communities she'd researched were genuinely attractive, offering services and social opportunities that could enhance quality of life for many seniors. Her presentation acknowledged my competence and independence, while suggesting that choosing such a lifestyle would be smart planning rather than necessary protection. The catch became apparent when Rachel started discussing the financial details more specifically. She suggested that David could handle the sale of my house and the transition to senior living, managing the complex paperwork and negotiations that could be overwhelming for someone dealing with such a major life change. She calculated that after purchasing a unit in one of these communities, I'd have substantial assets remaining that should be invested more aggressively to ensure long-term financial security. Rachel's plan would achieve everything David's manipulation had failed to accomplish. I'd voluntarily give up my house, turn over control of my assets to David for professional management, and move into a facility where my daily life would be monitored and regulated. The difference was that Rachel was presenting these outcomes as my choice rather than their imposition. I listened to Rachel's entire presentation before responding. Then I thanked her for the information and told her I'd consider her suggestions carefully. When she pressed for a timeline or commitment, I explained that such a major decision would require extensive research and consultation with my attorney and financial advisor. Rachel's expression shifted subtly when I mentioned professional advisor. She suggested that using outsiders for such personal family decisions might be unnecessarily expensive and impersonal. She reminded me that David had years of experience in real estate transactions and could handle everything more efficiently and cost-effectively than hired professionals. I responded by pointing out that David's real estate experience created a potential conflict of interest, since he would benefit financially from any decision I made to liquidate my assets. Professional advisors would be obligated to act in my best interests exclusively without any personal stake in the outcome. The conversation ended with Rachel promising to research additional options and suggesting that we should involve David in future discussions, since his expertise could be valuable in evaluating different scenarios. I agreed that David's input could be helpful, while privately noting that she was already planning to bring him back into control of my decision-making process. That evening, I called Margaret Foster to report on Rachel's visit and discuss my options for permanently protecting myself from future manipulation. Margaret explained that I could create a comprehensive estate plan that would prevent David and Rachel from ever gaining control of my assets, even if I became incapacitated in the future. The solution was elegant and decisive. Margaret would help me establish a revocable living trust with Eleanor as successor trustee, create advance directives specifying my preferences for medical care, and draft a will that clearly outlined my intentions for asset distribution. These documents would remove any ambiguity about my mental capacity and my wishes for the future. More importantly, Margaret suggested that I could use the threat of disinheritance as leverage to establish clear boundaries with David and Rachel. If they continued their attempts to manipulate or control me, I could simply revise my estate plan to exclude them entirely. The prospect of losing their expected inheritance might motivate them to respect my independence more than any amount of argumentation or reasoning. The plan was both protective and empowering. I would retain complete control of my assets during my lifetime, while ensuring that David and Rachel could never use legal or medical crises to override my autonomous decision. The documentation would prove my competence and intentions beyond any possible dispute. As I signed the papers in Margaret's office the following week, I felt a sense of finality and relief that surprised me with its intensity. For months I'd been fighting to maintain control of my own life while David and Rachel chipped away at my independence piece by piece. Now I had the legal protection and professional support necessary to end their manipulation permanently. The real test would come when David and Rachel learned about my new legal arrangements. Margaret predicted that they would escalate their efforts one final time before accepting defeat, possibly involving other family members or making dramatic threats about cutting off contact entirely. I was prepared for their reaction because I finally understood something fundamental about our relationship. David and Rachel had never seen me as a person with inherent dignity and autonomy. They'd seen me as a resource to be managed, a problem to be solved, and eventually an obstacle to be overcome. Once I stopped allowing them to treat me as anything less than an equal adult, they would have to decide whether they wanted a relationship with me on respectful terms or no relationship at all. The decision was no longer mine to make. I'd already chosen dignity and independence. Now it was their turn to choose whether they could accept a grandmother and mother who refused to be controlled, manipulated, or diminished by their greed and arrogance. The final confrontation was coming, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I was looking forward to it. The final confrontation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when David and Rachel stormed into my house using their key, one last time. They'd discovered that I'd changed my estate planning and were absolutely furious. David's face was red with anger as he demanded to know how I could be so vindictive as to threaten his inheritance after everything he'd done for me over the years. Rachel was more calculating in her rage, accusing me of being manipulated by outsiders who were taking advantage of my confusion to drive a wedge between our families. She insisted that no competent person would make such drastic legal changes without consulting their family first, and that my actions proved I was being influenced by people who didn't have my best interests at heart. I listened to their accusations calmly, then walked to my front door and held it open. I told them they had two choices. They could apologize for their behavior over the past months and commit to treating me with respect going forward, or they could leave my house immediately and not return until they were ready to behave like civilized adults. David's response was exactly what I'd expected. He said I was being manipulated by my lawyer and Eleanor into making decisions that would destroy our family relationship. He claimed that removing his access to my accounts and changing my estate plan was evidence that I wasn't thinking clearly, and that people who truly cared about me wouldn't encourage such destructive action. Rachel added that they'd consulted with their own attorney about my recent behavior, and had been advised that there were legal options available when elderly family members were being exploited by outsiders. She suggested that if I continued down this path, they might have no choice but to seek court intervention to protect me from people who were taking advantage of my vulnerability. The threat of legal action was their final card, and playing it was a serious mistake. I informed them that Margaret Foster had anticipated exactly this response, and had prepared comprehensive documentation of my mental capacity, the timeline of their manipulation attempts, and the legal remedies available to victims of financial elder abuse. I explained that any court proceeding they initiated would result in a full investigation of their own behavior, including the nearly $200,000 they'd taken from me over the years with no repayment plan. Margaret had assured me that judges were extremely skeptical of family members who suddenly questioned an elderly person's competence after being cut off from their money. David's bravado crumbled when he realized the legal exposure his threats had created. He started backtracking, insisting that he'd never intended to take legal action against his own mother, and that Rachel had misunderstood their attorney's advice about protecting elderly family members from exploitation. But I was done with their manipulation and excuses. I told them both that they had exactly 60 seconds to leave my house voluntarily, or I would call the police and report them for trespassing. When David started to argue, I picked up my phone and began dialing. They left, but not before Rachel delivered one final threat. She said that if I was determined to destroy our family relationships over money, then maybe Tyler was better off learning the truth about how selfish and vindictive his grandmother really was. She promised that Tyler would hear their side of the story and would understand why they'd tried so hard to protect him from my increasingly erratic behavior. The threat to poison Tyler against me was painful, but I'd prepared for this possibility as well. I'd already written a detailed letter to my grandson explaining the situation from my perspective, including copies of the financial records showing his parents' dependence on my generosity and documentation of their attempts to control my life. Eleanor had agreed to deliver the letter if David and Rachel tried to prevent Tyler from hearing my side of the story. 3 weeks passed in blessed silence. No unexpected visits, no manipulative phone calls, no concerned messages about my well-being. I spent the time reconnecting with friends I'd neglected while managing family drama, returning to volunteer activities I'd abandoned, and simply enjoying the peace of making my own decisions without interference or criticism. Tyler called on a Thursday evening, and his voice carried a maturity I hadn't heard before. He apologized for the things he'd said during our last conversation, explaining that his parents had been telling him I was sick and confused and he'd been genuinely worried about me. He said he'd received my letter and wanted to hear my side of the story directly. We talked for over an hour about the situation with his parents, about growing up and learning to think independently, and about the difference between loving someone and trying to control them. Tyler admitted that he'd been uncomfortable with some of the things his parents had said about me, but had been told that questioning their judgment would be disloyal and hurtful. By the end of our conversation, Tyler had made his own decision about our relationship. He said he was old enough to choose who he wanted to spend time with, and he wanted to continue having a relationship with his grandmother regardless of his parents' objection. We arranged for him to visit the following weekend, and he promised to drive himself so his parents couldn't use transportation as a way to control our contact. David and Rachel made one final attempt to regain control by sending me a formal letter through their attorney, demanding that I submit to a neuropsychological evaluation to determine my competence to make financial decisions. The letter threatened guardianship proceedings if I refused to cooperate with their reasonable concerns about my mental state. Margaret Foster's response was swift and devastating. She filed a cease and desist order demanding that David and Rachel stop harassing me with threats of legal action, and she submitted my own neuropsychological evaluation results from an independent specialist who'd found me fully competent. She also filed a formal complaint with the State Bar Association against their attorney for threatening frivolous guardianship proceedings. The legal pressure ended their campaign immediately. David's attorney withdrew from representation after realizing the weakness of their case and the potential sanctions for pursuing meritless claims. Without legal support for their manipulation tactics, David and Rachel finally accepted that their control over my life was permanently ended. 6 months later, I ran into Rachel at the grocery store. She was polite but distant, asking perfunctory questions about my health and commenting on how well I looked. There was no mention of our family conflict or any suggestion that we should reconcile our differences. During our brief conversation, Rachel mentioned that David's real estate business was struggling because of increased competition and market changes. She said they'd had to make some difficult financial adjustments and were considering downsizing their house to reduce expense. The subtext was clear. They were facing the natural consequences of their poor financial planning without my resources to bail them out. I responded with polite sympathy but offered no assistance. Rachel seemed to understand that the days of automatic financial support were over, and she didn't ask for help directly. We parted cordially like distant acquaintances rather than family members. Tyler graduated from high school and chose a college 3 hours away, partly to gain independence from his parents' controlling tendencies. He visits me regularly and calls every week, maintaining the close relationship we'd always shared. He's learned valuable lessons about autonomy and respect from watching his grandmother stand up to manipulation. Eleanor and I still take our weekly walks around the neighborhood, and she still marvels at how completely I transformed the family dynamic by refusing to accept unacceptable behavior. She says I inspired her to be more assertive with her own adult children when they occasionally overstep appropriate boundaries. I still live in my house on Maple Street, still drive my reliable Honda Civic, and still manage my own affairs with complete independence. At 73, I'm healthier and happier than I've been in years, freed from the stress of constantly defending my autonomy against family members who confused love with control. The money I spent on legal protection was the best investment I ever made. Margaret Foster helped me create a comprehensive estate plan that ensures my wishes will be respected regardless of future family pressure, and her firm provides ongoing support for any issues that arise. Sometimes I think about the woman I was before this ordeal began, always saying yes to family requests, always accommodating other people's preferences, always prioritizing harmony over honesty. That woman was kind and generous, but she was also vulnerable to exploitation by people who mistook her kindness for weakness. The woman I am now understands that true love requires respect for autonomy, that healthy relationships are built on equality rather than control, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's dysfunction. I'm still kind and generous, but now I'm also strong and self-protective. David and Rachel taught me an invaluable lesson, though I'm sure it wasn't the lesson they intended. They showed me that family relationships based on financial dependency and emotional manipulation aren't worth preserving, and that blood relationships don't excuse disrespectful behavior. I drive to the bank every month now, not because I'm running away from something, but because I'm driving toward the life I choose to live. The road ahead is mine to navigate, and that makes all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.